Welcome to the Secrets of the Bible channel. We are gathered here today to reflect on the story of Jephthah, the judge of Israel, whose tragic tale is recounted in the book of Judges, chapter 11. Jephthah was a valiant warrior, son of Gilead and a prostitute, driven out by his brothers who did not accept him. He went into exile in the land of Tob and became the leader of a band of raiders. When the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead came to beg Jephthah to return and save them. Jephthah agreed on the condition that he would become the leader of the people if he won the victory. Before going to fight against the Ammonites, Jephthah made this terrible vow to the Lord. "If you will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hands, then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." Judges 1130. 31, New King James Version. Jephthah won a great victory thanks to the Lord's help. But when he returned, it was his only daughter who first came out of his house, with tambourines and dancing, to celebrate his triumph. Seeing her, Jephthah tore his clothes and cried out, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord and I cannot go back on it." Judges 1135, New King James Version. His daughter answered him, "My father, if you have given your word to the Lord, do to me according to what has come out of your mouth, because the Lord has avenged you of your enemies." Judges 1136, New King James Version. After spending 2 months in the mountains weeping over her lost virginity with her companions, she returned to her father, who fulfilled the terrible promise made to the Lord. My friends, let us meditate on this painful story, which raises many questions. First, let's put it back into its historical context. At that time, Israel was under the domination of powerful invaders, the Philistines to the west and the Ammonites to the east. The Jewish people were going through troubled times. When a new threat weighed upon them, they called upon judges, military and political leaders raised up by God to deliver Israel. It is in this context that Jephthah intervened. Next, let's look at the custom of human sacrifice, common at the time among many pagan peoples. Yet it was formally prohibited by the Mosaic Law. In his misplaced zeal and desire to win divine favor, Jephthah thus committed a serious transgression. The Lord had not asked for such a sacrifice at all. As the prophet Micah said, "He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Micah 6:8, NKJV, exploring the complex relationship between Jephthah and his only daughter, also sheds light on this drama. This young girl shows admirable courage and selflessness, as her father prepares to sacrifice her because of a foolish vow. She encourages him to keep his word, accepting her tragic fate with amazing faith and resignation. But Jephthah's reaction is just as telling. Seeing her approach, he tears his clothes in grief, showing how shattered he is at the thought of losing the one he loves most. Yet blinded by his fanaticism, he chooses to fulfill his vow rather than listen to his conscience. This is the height of the inner conflict tormenting him. This heart-rending story illustrates the dangers of thoughtless, disproportionate promises, guided by excessive zeal rather than wisdom. It also warns us against the temptation of human sacrifice, a barbaric practice that reduces the beloved to the status of an object offered to win heavenly favors. Let us remember Samuel's words, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams." 1 Samuel 15:22, New King James Version. Let us learn from the lesson of wisdom and moderation in this ancient drama. Neither extreme zeal nor excessive promises can please the Lord. He calls us to justice, mercy, and love. May we walk humbly with him, listening to his voice in our conscience rather than the blindness of passion or fanaticism. Now let's analyze more closely the vow made by Jephthah before fighting the Ammonites. Indeed, it has sparked much debate among biblical commentators. Was it really a vow to make a burnt offering, implying the sacrifice of his daughter? Or was it simply a vow to consecrate her to the Lord? Let's examine the main arguments made on both sides. First, the Hebrew text uses an ambiguous phrasing that can be translated either as, "I will offer it up as a burnt offering," or more generally as, "I will consecrate it with a solemn vow." This linguistic subtlety is at the heart of the exegetical controversy. Some commentators, like the 11th century Rabbi Rashi, argue that Jephthah devoted his daughter to a life of divine service, similar to Samuel's parents consecrating their son to the Lord. 1 Samuel 1:11, New King James Version. According to this interpretation, she would have had to renounce marriage and motherhood, hence her weeping over her virginity. But this was not a sacrifice in the literal sense. This reading is supported by the fact that the Mosaic Law strictly prohibited human sacrifice, a practice of neighboring pagan cults that Israel had to categorically reject. Some also point out that child sacrifice is nowhere else mentioned in the Bible concerning Israel. However, most traditional exegetes have always interpreted this vow in the literal sense as the promise to really sacrifice the first person who came to meet Jephthah. They emphasize that the text heavily insists on the irrevocable nature of the promise, which binds Jephthah to the point that he cannot go back on it. But if it had just been a vow of consecration for his daughter, nothing prevented him from revoking it to spare her, as Samuel's parents did. Indeed, in 1 Samuel 1:11 NKJV, it is reported that Samuel's parents, Hannah and Elkanah, had made a vow to consecrate their son to the Lord's service. Once Samuel was weaned, they took him to the temple of Shiloh for him to be raised by the priest Eli. However, it is specified later in 1 Samuel 2:19 NKJV that Hannah continued to visit him every year when she went up to the temple, and made him a little robe that she brought him. We understand, therefore, that Samuel was indeed consecrated to the temple in accordance with his parents' vow, but that they maintained a close bond with him, and did not abandon him completely, unlike what Jephthah did with his daughter. In this sense, if Jephthah had only made a vow of consecration for his daughter, he could have, like Samuel's parents, go back on this vow to spare her without completely denying it. Moreover, the book of Judges depicts a dark and chaotic time when the Mosaic Law was often flouted in favor of pagan practices. Human sacrifices, however reprehensible, were not uncommon in those troubled times. Other verses in the book of Judges allude to this as well. Judges 1:7-5, in addition, the sacrifice of the firstborn, especially in the case of military victory, was a widespread practice among many peoples neighboring Israel. Some commentators see this as the influence of the surrounding cultural context on Jephthah, which led him to make this fateful vow. Furthermore, Jephthah's heart-rending reaction at the sight of his only daughter coming out of his house would hardly make sense if it were merely a vow to consecrate her to the temple. Likewise, the girl's weeping over her virginity would be meaningless in that case. Everything indicates that she is preparing herself to die prematurely. The traditional stance is also supported by the fact that the church fathers from the earliest centuries mostly interpreted this story as the actual fulfillment of a vow of burnt offering. Among them, let us note St. Augustine Thomas Aquinas, as well as many medieval rabbis like Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Kimhi. However, since the 20th century, a growing number of exegetes have challenged this literal reading, and again defended the idea of a simple vow of consecration. They rely in particular on fine textual analyses that reveal contradictions and implausibilities in the story, as it has come down to us. Thus, several details appear as later additions aimed at transforming a vow of consecration into a human sacrifice for theological reasons. The mention of the weeping for virginity seems artificially introduced to justify the premature death of the girl. Likewise, Jephthah's excessive reaction of tearing his clothes when seeing her appears to forcefully amplify the tragedy of the scene to lend credence to the sacrifice thesis. Moreover, the place of sacrifice is never specified, whereas this indication would have been critical. Finally, some argue that it would be unthinkable for the biblical author, who opposed human sacrifice, to relate such a scandalous episode without explicitly condemning it, or even making a moral judgment. This silence can be explained if Jephthah's initial vow was distorted by tradition. At the end of this overview of exegetical arguments, it must be acknowledged that the debate remains wide open. While the traditional thesis of actual sacrifice retains solid foundations, numerous textual and contextual subtleties plead in favor of reinterpreting the vow as a simple consecration, despite the ambiguity of the original text. Perhaps this indeterminacy is deliberate on the part of the biblical author, who may have wanted to warn his readers against making excessive promises to God while leaving them free to discern or not. The confirmation of the prohibition of human sacrifice. In any case, beyond the exegetical controversies, the main message that emerges from this dark story remains a salutary warning. As Ecclesiastes says, when you make a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? Ecclesiastes 5:4-6, New King James Version. Let us pray for the wisdom never to make thoughtless oaths, lest we become enslaved to them and cause irreparable tragedies. My friends, the heartbreaking story of Jephthah and his daughter is told in the book of Judges chapter 11. Holds many lessons for us who seek to walk in the Lord's way today. Fourthly, Jephthah's heart-rending reaction illustrates the distress that arises when our allegiances conflict. Torn between his rash vow and fatherly love, Jephthah ultimately chose loyalty to his oath, rather than mercy toward his daughter. Let us learn to resolve ethical dilemmas in the light of the greatest commandment, which is to love God and neighbor. Romans 8:28. Finally, beyond Jephthah's specific case, this dark story reminds us of the need to always consider biblical narratives in their entirety. Scripture unambiguously condemns human sacrifice and murder. Deuteronomy 12:31. Let us beware of drawing erroneous lessons by isolating certain episodes from their overall context. For me, the key lesson that emerges from Jephthah's drama lies in a call to cultivate empathy and mercy, even in situations of apparent moral conflict. Faced with the excruciating dilemma he faced, Jephthah could have found a compassionate way out had he listened to the faint voice of pity, rather than locking himself into the relentless logic of his vow. Admittedly, going back on his word would have required the humility to publicly acknowledge a mistake. But how noble it would have been to assume this reversal to save an innocent life, especially that of his own daughter. Jephthah would then have shown true greatness of soul and set an example of that wisdom which is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy, according to the Apostle James, James 3:17. Instead, by blindly sticking to his ill-fated vow, Jephthah accomplished precisely what the Bible warns us against, respecting the letter of the law, but denying its spirit of compassion. This Pharisaic rigidity stifles mercy, yet the foremost virtue in Jesus' eyes. As Christ taught in various parables, human distress must always take precedence over rules when their strict enforcement leads to aberrations. Man was not made for the law, but the law for man's good. Thus, faced with a moral conflict, let us ask, what does the voice of conscience enlightened by love dictate here? How can I best act to relieve suffering and preserve everyone's dignity? Let us cultivate empathy that allows us to put ourselves in the other's place, feeling their distress as our own. And let mercy temper the blind rigor of rules, oaths, and relentless logic. Such is the path of true wisdom, that of Christ. May we all grow in this spirit of empathic discernment and concrete mercy. And when we fall short of this ideal, may we pick ourselves up again with humility, thanks to the tireless forgiveness of our Father who is in heaven.